Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Hello, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan. Hello, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today it's my pleasure to welcome Kelly Rigg. Kelly Rigg has been at the forefront of international environmental movements for years, for decades, 3 in fact. She's led campaigns on climate change, energy transition, preserving Earth's oceans, and saving Antarctica. It all began in '82 when the Ronald Reagan administration, decided to make 1 billion offshore acres accessible to oil and gas drilling. That's billion, 1 billion with a B. Rigg in that year joined Greenpeace International that summer, campaigning against opening the entire US continental shelf to destructive development. Working with Greenpeace on and off for 20 years, Rigg's role grew from campaign and project coordinator, focusing on wildlife and offshore drilling, to deputy campaigns director, where she developed projects centering on oceans, forests, and the Amazon. From 1986 to 1990, she led Greenpeace's successful worldwide movement to save Antarctica, combining policy change with field expeditions, helping establish a scientific base on the ice. Throughout her tenure, Rigg represented Greenpeace at the United Nations, always with a voice reminding the coalition about the state of the environment. In 2002, she led Greenpeace's campaign at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, highlighting climate change and renewable energy. At the European Union for Coastal Conservation, Rigg served as a senior policy advisor for over 2 years. Under the Council of Europe's Biodiversity Strategy Offices, she created a code of conduct for activities in coastal areas. These measures protect marine biodiversity to this very day. In 2004, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, the DSCC, was founded in response to international concerns over the harmful impacts of deep sea bottom trawling. As coordinator, Rigg helped develop the efforts of more than 90 non-governmental organizations, fisheries, and law and policy institutes to work together to safeguard vulnerable aquatic oceans ecosystems. Continuing her work as an advocate for the planet, Rigg became the executive director at the Global Campaign for Climate Action in 2009. There, she led a major international alliance advocating for fair, ambitious, and binding global climate agreement. That organization, the GCCA, public-facing campaign, was the Tick, Tick, Tick campaign. The tick, 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 obviously symbolizing the ticking of a clock and the urgency needed to take serious action to tackle the climate change issue. Tick, tick, tick's website provides an online climate zone and data finder for 80,000 locations worldwide. The information goes back as far as 1980 and is updated every 10 minutes. You can imagine what a resource that is for climate activists, policymakers, and scientists alike. In 2003, Rigg co-founded the Varda Group and serves as its director today. It's a consultancy association providing campaign and strategic advice to many non-governmental organizations. The Varda Group coordinates services on environmental, sustainable, health, and social issues. Its mission is to create policy change by developing and implementing projects that lead to improving people and the planet. Easy to see that Kelly Rigg has been a formidable climate leader for decades and has helped make the world a cleaner, safer, and wilder place to be. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Kelly Rigg. Welcome, Kelly Rigg. Thanks so much for doing this, going on Curiosity Invited. I appreciate it a lot. I look forward to a fun conversation, or it's not fun, and perhaps at times depressing, and etc. I probably should say truth in advertising to everybody. We have known each other for many years, starting in probably 1980, maybe no,
No,
probably
78.
70 something. Yeah, 78.
78.
Right. And although I will say in the last 20 to 30 years, we've known each other hardly at all. So it's one of those interesting, there's an old friend that is a stranger and an old friend. So hi, how are you?
I'm good, and I'm very curious to see how this is going to go. But I'm well. I live in Amsterdam, and so it is gray, although a bit warm outside, but definitely not like summer as it would be. Well, probably not in your part of the woods either yet. But no, it's I'm good.
Cool. And well, so I read your resume. I mean, I read your bio, one of the many that's out there, and multiple decades. At the time, it was 3. It's clearly 4 now. And
sadly, yes.
Yeah. And before we talk about those things, how did this happen? Like, where did it come from? Did you start as a little child?
No, you were a part of it, actually. You may not remember this, but
I don't remember much, but
so we were in San Francisco, and somebody sold you a button. It said "Save the Whales" and Greenpeace. Oh, yeah. And you were kind of interested in it. And at a point when I had left school because I had an illness that I needed to deal with, and I did it through sort of alternative medicine, and dropped out of everything for a few years. And when I came back, I kind of remembered that Save the Whales thing. And when I went back to school, I kind of got interested in environmental issues, and I did my degree in environmental studies and became completely fascinated with Greenpeace in that time. And I just knew that I wanted to go work for Greenpeace when I left school. Actually, that's not quite true. I was debating whether to go to law school first. Had a lot of friends who were in law school at the time, and thought about that. And my dad, for Christmas that year, my dad, who worked for Bechtel,
yes, I remember,
gave me a briefcase, a boxy briefcase, as a gift. And I took one look at it and I thought, law school, Greenpeace, I'm going for Greenpeace. And so that was kind of this defining moment.
As I recall, you went to Boston.
Yeah.
You went to the Boston area and you started essentially door-to-door fundraising for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I basically, I lined up an internship. I still had a few credits left to go before graduating. And my advisor let me just do the last of that at Greenpeace as an intern to the communications manager at the Boston office. Yeah. But that was not paid, and I had to earn a bit of a living. I got a sort of a free room and board by working at a junior college nearby, just as a resident director, where I had to be on duty one night a week and one weekend a month, just living in a dorm.
So you were brave back then.
I was brave. And, but yeah, I still needed to eat. So the door-to-door canvassing was kind of what gave me a little bit of an income to live off of until I got my first job. About 5 months later, I got a paid job.
With Greenpeace?
Yeah.
With Greenpeace. And, well, I'm going to jump forward and then jump backwards, but well, so you were with Greenpeace almost 20 years. Is that true or no?
Yeah. Yeah.
And why at one point you decided at some point to leave? Was there a reason? I'm not looking for dirt or anything like it. Did you suddenly feel like you could be more effective elsewhere? Or?
So I basically grew up campaigning. I did a lot of campaign work, but eventually worked my way into senior management. And senior management is really no fun.
No.
Honestly. I mean, sometimes you can take great satisfaction in empowering other people to get stuff done, but you've got a lot of organizational things to deal with. And I think, having lived through several restructurings, and, I'm one of these people that's extremely well organized and set up systems to deal with things. And then periodically, some of the more activist people say, this is just bureaucracy. Let's just throw all this out. And they throw it all out. And then everything would fall apart and descend into chaos for a while. And then somebody would say, oh, we need a system. We need a planning system. And I'd say, I know what to do. And then I'd redesign it. And this was sort of about the third time we had gone through that. And I just thought, I just don't feel like doing this anymore. So I decided, and along with a couple of other Greenpeace people, we decided to just venture out and talk about the same sorts of things we did in Greenpeace, but for other groups, and try to help make other groups more effective if we could, which, that's what I've been doing now, the second 20 years of this 40-year career.
Right. With the group that you started, the
Varda group, yeah.
Right. This is a really interesting question, because it is a genuine question. Does Greenpeace still exist? Are they still active? I mean, one of the things that, where this question comes from, why it's surprising to me, is that, Greenpeace was, it was synonymous with the environmental movement. I don't know if maybe people could mention like Sea Shepherd at the time. There wasn't much standing out. There might have been a lot going on, but there wasn't much that really stood out. And Greenpeace was like, the thing. And I don't really watch the news, but Greenpeace, the name doesn't come up at all. Are they still around?
Yes,
Must be.
they are. And Greenpeace is a way more complicated organization now than it was when I started. It's present in many, many, many more countries. And one of our strengths back in the beginning, in those early days, was one of the ways you break through all of the background noise is by painting things in very black and white pictures. This is right, this is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. We are bearing witness to that. We are standing up for what is right. And suddenly, when you're a big international organization with offices in a lot of different countries, including some places that are quite complicated, things aren't always as black and white. And what may be black and white in one country, if you portray it that way, would do serious damage in another country. Mm-hmm. So I'll just give you one example.
You mean so they've adjusted their message?
It's not a message. I'll just give you just a very simple example.
Yeah.
In the early days, you see people out, harpooning whales, you get in between them and try to stop that from happening. Well, at some point, when we had a Norwegian office, what we learned from the Norwegians was that every time we went against a Norwegian whaling operation, it set back the ability to phase it out many years, because you ended up getting the population screaming and yelling, protecting my country. They get all nationalistic about it. So suddenly you find out that, what you're doing may rile up the North American public or the British public or the Germans or the Dutch, but you're actually maybe creating some backlash in a country where you're trying to work with people to think about, is this really necessary? Are there better ways to either earn income or get protein or whatever that is? And you let the next generation kind of, phase that out. That's just one small example.
Did you end up with, whether it's you, did you end up with, or did others end up with a felt sense that the message or the tactics, the message, the thrust, the energy needed to be, was somehow watered down? Or did people feel like, did the same people, or another version of the people who thought systems was just bureaucracy, did they also feel like, oh, we're not saving the whales anymore. We're just selling out. Was there that tension in the organization, or no?
There were probably some who thought that, and those people left, but I think that I don't see it as a sellout. I see it as
No, right.
you're trying to achieve something, and direct action is one tool. And confronting, I still believe with all of my heart that killing whales is wrong. But I think that you have to start thinking about how you achieve change. And achieving change is not always as black and white and straightforward
Right.
as you sometimes think it is. Now, for some people, that would probably be viewed as a sellout. For other people, you think it's just being more realistic. Yeah, it's a hard call. It's a hard question. You do sometimes think, am I just getting older? Am I becoming less activist? But yeah, I don't know. I just think you have to look at the best way you're going to win.
Right. Also, yes, well, it doesn't always happen this way, but one hopes that as one gets older, the experience at some point may turn into wisdom and good discerning judgment. And so, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. And, thank God there's always a place for people who are willing to get out there and jump up and down and scream. I was just having a conversation a couple of weeks back with, I don't know if you remember the name Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers was one of the founders of the Weather Underground, and still active. And in some ways, as far as he's concerned, he's now retired, although he's retired teaching virtually full time, but a retired college professor who sees and create the direct link between what they were doing with the Weather Underground and teaching. And and it's pretty compelling.
I just want to say, though, I also don't
Please.
want to give you the misconception that Greenpeace isn't doing action anymore. I mean, it does things, a lot of things in a national context, which is driven by a national campaign, for example, or it's doing things, for example, you may have heard about what was called the Arctic 30 campaign, in which activists on one of the Greenpeace ships went and protested at an oil drilling rig belonging to the Russians, and they got taken and put into a Siberian prison for a little while, and it was touch and go whether they were going to get out again. So it's not like,
Right.
that's not happening. It's just happening in different places. And I think the US media is not always very
Well, that was what I was
interested in reporting
ask.
what Greenpeace does.
Right. Yeah, I suspect that's true. They didn't drop their latest single, so it's hard to get coverage. Well, so okay, 4 decades in that world, immersed in that world. How are we doing? We being, yeah, how, I mean, we can talk about how are you doing, but how are we doing? It is certainly a lot of your energy, maybe not enough of other people's energy, but a lot of energy by active, well-minded people, savvy, knowledgeable. Are things better? I don't mean is everybody, sort of dancing through the flowers and we can all rest easily, but how are we doing?
Well, is the glass half empty or half full? I could
That's
say
what I'm asking.
there are lots of things in the glass, for sure. I ran a campaign to save Antarctica in the 1980s, and we won that. In terms of trying to prevent the minerals development of the Antarctic, offshore oil and gas or mining for other minerals, that almost certainly would have happened had it not been for that campaign. Air quality is so much better, at least in many places, not everywhere, certainly not in many developing countries. But I mean, I was amazed. I was in Los Angeles recently, where I grew up, and the air wasn't, flying into the city. It wasn't like this brown, dark layer of sludge you had to land into to get through it. So certain things have improved. Whales aren't being massacred in the numbers that they used to be. Small pockets of it still, but some of them are coming back. The ozone hole is healing. That was a campaign that was amazingly quick, considering it involved an international agreement, and the countries of the world came together in cooperation and actually made an agreement to, again, not everything is perfect in that regard, but massive, massive change. So there are a lot of success stories. That's the glass half full. The glass half empty, of course, is that climate change threatens to pretty much undo everything. And the loss of biodiversity, for example, as well. Those things are so big, in the too big to fail category. And, who was it who said, climate change is really an everything campaign. It's just, it involves everything. So, and we're not doing so well there. I mean, we're not doing as bad as we might have been had we not gotten agreements at the international level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And some things are happening at the national level in some countries that are really making huge progress in that regard. But it's still a bit too little too late. And it's going to require a Herculean effort to bring that down to safe levels.
It occurred to me, this was not on my mind before, but what's your take on the sort of some of the solutions? I don't know if solutions, but being proposed that is essentially geoengineering.
Oof.
I would tell. Well, there you go. Okay. You want to elaborate on that?
Well, first of all, I think the biggest thing we could do in terms of geoengineering is to stop screwing with the planet in the first place and allow the natural systems to do what they do. But when you start screwing around with natural systems, for example, if you want to start reducing sunlight or, all of these strange things that are being proposed, or putting iron into the sea in the hopes of, locking in more CO2 in the oceans, you're screwing around with planetary systems for which we, barely know what we're doing.
Yeah, right.
No. And I just think that we have the solutions. We know what to do. We know how to fix the problem. It's really a question of implementing them at scale. I mean, you look at what's happening in Europe as a result of the Ukrainian war. There's a big gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, which the Germans have been insisting for years and years and years it needs to go through. Suddenly within about a week's time, okay, we're stopping that. And now everybody's talking about banning imports of Russian oil and over time Russian gas as well. I mean, that's when governments decide they are going to react as if there's a crisis. It's amazing how quickly things can change. I mean, there's problems with ramping up alternative sources to those Russian supplies in the short term. There may have to be some compromises in the short term, but it just goes to show you that when they decide there's a crisis, they will get it together really quickly. And why governments still, even those that are actively working to stop climate change, still act like we have more time than we do is just beyond me. I don't understand it.
Is it demoralizing?
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at these young people who are out there, in the US, you've had the fire drill Fridays and you've got the Friday school strikes. And I look at those young people and I just feel like, we've really failed them. In 1990 was when I first started campaigning on this issue. 1991, I was the campaign coordinator for Greenpeace for its Atmosphere and Energy campaign. We knew then what needed to be done. And if we had done it, if governments had taken it seriously, we would have had a much slower, more leisurely transition than what we're looking at now. And, even Margaret Thatcher has speeches back then saying that we have to do something about this. This was not like a big political football issue so much as it is today. So I feel like our generation really let the generations that are coming up now, we really let them down. And I feel, even though I know that I did everything I could in my power to make a difference, it's still hard not to feel bad about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember who it was. It said, it may have been a comedian who said, that because we all remember, well, anybody who's got a little bit of this color hair remembers that, you couldn't have a conversation about the environment without somebody saying, well, what about our children and what about our grandchildren? And it's pretty clear that the response has been, oh, fuck them. Really?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
whatever.
And what's
Let
even
them worry
worse about that, and what's even more horrible, is that we talk about it as if it being our children and our grandchildren, which it is. But there are many parts of the world where it is happening right now.
Now,
In
absolutely.
India and Pakistan, this heat wave, I don't know if you saw the video that was circulating in the last couple of days of this melting glacier, which just took out this whole bridge. I mean, it's happening. There's this heat wave. People are dying from it. And yeah, as always with these things, it's the poor and marginalized who are going to feel the impacts first.
So, question, so are you an optimist or a pessimist? I mean, how are you feeling about the world, where we are, where we're heading?
People say, the best time to have taken action would have been 30 years ago, and the second best time to do it is now. And so I just keep feeling like you have to just still keep trying to make it less bad than it will be otherwise.
Right.
And I'm optimistic that we are moving in the right direction in terms of doing that. I'm not optimistic that we are going to somehow avoid, I mean, it's already happening, and it's, there's a lot of greenhouse gases already baked into the system. So we are not going to eliminate the threat entirely. But I think that, all we can do is continue to do our best. And I have to also say that I'm really good at compartmentalizing things. First of all, I found that the best antidote to being freaked out about the whole thing was working on it. So that's one good thing. It desensitizes you a little bit. And then secondly, when I'm not in my work mode, I just try not to think about it. I really just try to put it in a little box and just think about, I love to swim. I love to do photography, and I focus on the things that I like doing, family occasions, all of those things. And just put it in a little box.
But are there places in your life where you don't have to tell us what they are, but you can, like, to that end, sort of as a footnote to that piece, where you're cutting corners, you would tell other people, hey, you need to stop me, whatever the hell it is. And that you're cutting corners there because there's just so much you can do. I can't think about that. I can't do that. Are there places where you do that? You find yourself doing that even after these bazillions of years?
Yes, of course. I'm not a saint. There's a lot of sacrifices I do make, but not enough to do everything that is necessary, for sure. I think the one thing that it's important to remember is that as much as having individuals take action is important, you're not going to solve climate change through individual action. It has to be collective action. It has to be at the government level. There has to be incentives and cost-effective solutions. Those are the things that are going to bring emissions down. You look at the pandemic, and everybody stopped flying, everybody stayed home and whatever. Greenhouse gases didn't go down that much. Most greenhouse gases, it comes from industry. It comes from a lot of things that are a little bit outside of the control of individuals. Mm-hmm. So I find that I try to strike a balance between enjoying my life and but also being very conscious of it. And I do make sacrifices, but I also try to enjoy myself as well.
Yeah, that sounds sane.
I can tell you in Amsterdam, I don't need a car. Don't own a car.
You don't own a car.
I recently had to acquire one in the US for when I'm there at a big we have a family place. So it is, yeah, it was cheaper than renting one. But otherwise, I don't use a car. I don't own a car. I get everywhere by my bike, public transportation, trains, in town or whatever. If I absolutely need a car because I need to move something or whatever, I have a subscription. I log in online and reserve my car at, like €3.50 an hour or something like that. And it's
interesting. I remember you just reminded me years ago. Was it in Portland? I don't remember if it was in Portland or I don't remember if it was in Portland or Seattle. Went to visit family, and not mine. Well, mine by marriage, but and there was a big section of downtown where, in the conversation with, I guess it was my father-in-law, I was like, wait, it's free? Public transportation was free. He said, yeah, well, they're trying to encourage people to use public transportation. And it was one of those, like, it was like, getting smacked in the head, like, oh, how simple and how brilliant. You want to encourage people to use public transportation, make it free. And so a huge portion of downtown, and I don't recall which one it was, which city it was, but it was just like, you get on the trolley or the bus or the whatever it is, and you get off, and you get on and you get off. And it was just, and then, when people were used to it, that it started to be a minimal cost. Well, low cost. And people started using public transportation for very low cost. And they had sort of gotten in the habit, and it was easy and it was plentiful. And it was like, oh, this is what a fabulous thing. What a fabulous thing. You don't have to get in the car. I'll tell you, one of the reasons I moved from where I was, which was, in the middle of the woods, essentially, to here, one of the reasons. So I moved from the Santa Cruz Mountains in California to the high desert in Powell, Wyoming. And but one of the reasons was, if I wanted to go hiking from where I lived in California, I walked out of my house and there I was. But if I wanted to do anything else, and I mean anything else, I had to get in a car.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this is terrible. So I want the place. I want to be able to walk to the coffee shop. I want to walk to the hardware store. I want to walk to the drugstore. And, I can see the hardware store down there. So it's that part is delightful and wonderful. And the numbers of people I see getting in their cars to make short trips is astonishing. It's astonishing.
Well, we don't have free transportation here in Amsterdam, but gas costs a fortune. Parking costs a fortune.
Yeah.
And getting around Amsterdam in a car is about the most inconvenient thing you can do, because you've got narrow streets that weren't built for, at least in the city center, aren't built for cars. And, you get behind a garbage truck, you're screwed.
That's it. Goodbye.
And, or a delivery truck, and you just turn off your engine and sit and wait. You don't have people like honking and screaming so much, because that's just the reality. So owning a car, I mean, most of my friends own cars, I have to say, but a lot of them don't use it so often. You use it when you want to just go out to the beach or go out to someplace else. But I just don't.
Yeah,
basically.
Great. Good for you. Good for you. Can we sort of circle back? Can you talk about, or do you have any insight into, so the things you had to overcome kind of personally to go from Kelly Rigg, college student, engaged human being in whatever, to Kelly Rigg, activist, organizer, campaign leader, that's I remember some of the stories of, you're on a whaler with a bullhorn, and I don't mean a whaler like a whaling ship. I mean like a Boston whaler or a pontoon boat, a Zodiac. And that's not that's not always an easy transition for somebody to imagine themselves doing. So was it, did you have to somehow screw up your courage and do something, or did you go through a process? How'd you get from that perfectly lovely Kelly Rigg, that person way back then, to the person who was suddenly on the high seas doing things?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because it's something that was one of the most profound experiences in my life, actually. You remember, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, you knew me when I had just at the tail end of this healing process, where I had an illness that medical profession was saying a lot of unpleasant things. And it was a bad choice to do what they said versus taking it into my own hands and going through this process. And somebody else you had on your show, Gary David, was a big part of that process in helping me through it. And one of the things that I learned, there came this moment where I was almost giving up in that process. And I had to really confront the fact that I had to take a big risk. Medical profession wanted me to have a surgery, a really bad surgery. And I had to say no and have faith that this was the right thing. And that was really hard. That was scary. I mean, you don't just go up when I was 20 years old. You don't go up against what all these doctors, I was at UCLA Medical Center, are telling you you have to do to survive. But I did it, and it worked. And as I came out of that, and I went back to school, and as I said, I started getting interested in Greenpeace, but of course I was doing environmental studies. I knew about a lot of different organizations and different approaches. And the thing that I realized was that what I had done on a micro level was I learned that things don't get better incrementally. You don't just gradually, slowly get better. You have healing crises. Things come to a big head, and then suddenly something changes and everything gets ripped apart. And then when it comes back together again, it's slightly different. And it involves taking risks and being willing to put yourself on the line in order to have this greater benefit. And when I looked around at a lot of environmental organizations at that time, what I mostly saw, or at least what I perceived, was incremental change processes. Let's lobby for this. Let's push for that. You know, we put out reports and we push this report and we do these things. And what I realized as I learned more about Greenpeace, there is a book called Warriors of the Rainbow by Robert Hunter, who's one of the founders. That book just completely changed my life. This notion of bearing witness and getting out there, and when you think all is lost, suddenly something magical happens, and being willing to take that risk. And suddenly everything changes in a very big way. It's not incremental. And that's when I decided I wanted to work for Greenpeace. And so, yeah, I started working. And it's, you know, at that time, you know, it was very exciting if you got to do something on the ship. That was something you aspired to. You didn't automatically get to do that.
Yes, it's very different being on the ship or knocking on somebody's door and asking for money.
Yeah. Which
is probably a harder thing to do.
Yeah. So when I started, I worked in the office. As I said, I was canvassing, but I was volunteering on this. There was like a task force to try to save Georgia's bank, which at that time was one of the richest fisheries in the world, from offshore oil development. And suddenly, I don't know if you remember James Watt, the Interior Secretary under Ronald Reagan, decided they were going to lease the entire outer continental shelf of the United States to offshore oil development. And so suddenly I was Greenpeace decided to do a campaign, or looked at the idea of doing a campaign to stop this. And I was just this little person from Boston, just fresh out of college, part of this task force. And there was this guy who had been around longer than me, who'd written a proposal for this national campaign. And it was decided to fund it, but at a level that he didn't think was serious. So he said, screw it, I'm not doing it. So the campaign director at that time, who I'd never met in person, I'd just been on some calls. He said, well, you do it. I'm like, what do you mean me do it? Yeah, you do it.
He said it to you? He
Yeah,
said
he
to
said-
you, you do.
He said, yeah, you seem smart. You run it. And I'm like, me? You know, I was just suddenly like, holy shit, what's just happened to me? So suddenly I was put in charge of this campaign. And that involved the Rainbow Warrior was out in California. And the idea was there was a lease sale that was coming up. But, you know, it's not like something you can put the boat in front of to stop because it hasn't happened yet. You're trying to stop something before it happens.
Right.
So we decided to address seismic testing, which was the first step in the development in the exploration process. First, they do all the seismic testing just to see what's there, and then
See if the country
companies
will sort of disintegrate if they do drill there. Yes.
So they, you know, they decided, yeah, they do this testing, and that's what the oil companies, they use that data to then decide if it's worth bidding on this or not. They make an assessment as to whether they think there's oil and gas down there. So we decided we were going to go out and block a seismic testing operation, which, by the way, do have bad side effects. For example, for whales and whatever, it's big blasts underwater isn't good for living creatures. So I went out to California about 6 weeks early because I was utterly terrified. And I just thought,
and it's your campaign.
It's my campaign. And I mean, there were people in the San Francisco office working on it. I was the national coordinator. But there was this reputation of the ship's crew eating alive office staff, you know. So I went out there 6 weeks early to prove myself. And I went out where the boat was in dry dock in Oakland. And on the weekends, I went out and just, you know, worked, you know, needle gunning. And the guy who was in charge, I think, was just screwing around with me. And he put me inside the stack, you know, the smokestack thing with a needle gun. I don't know if you've ever done a needle gun before, but it's like a thing that has all these needles that kind of goes, you know, like this deafening noise, and it chips paint. They put me inside of the smokestack chipping paint for an entire weekend. You know, and other crew people.
How's your hearing?
I can't remember. I must have had headphones on. I don't remember, but I remember there was a little vent to the outside, and it was beautiful sunny weather, and people were outside painting, having a nice time. And there was this one guy who kept coming over, Rigg, how you doing in there? I'm fine, I'm just fine. You know, I had to like not be a wimp and prove myself. And anyway, so we did that thing, and it was successful because we happened to catch this boat operating outside of its permitted area. But, well, I can actually, I'll tell you, you asked me, you know, working up the courage. So here I am. So what we did was, so when you're trailing a seismic testing array, you got about like something like a mile of equipment being towed. And if you stop suddenly, that array sinks and you've lost the equipment. So we put these people out, we call them the rubber duckies, these little boats, like little rubber boats, but not like the Zodiacs with the motors. We put them out there with no means of propelling themselves. Maybe there was a little oar in there, I don't know. But anyway, we just put them all out in front, way out in front from this. They were running transects.
With people.
With people. And then I got on the phone to this ship on the radio and told them what we were doing and said, you have to stop. And so far out in front that they would have time to roll up their gear before anybody got hurt. And the guy says to me, no, we can't do that. And I'm like, well, these people are out there, they have no way to move. So you're going to have to stop or veer off. And if they veered off, it would hurt their data because they were doing these. So we had this standoff. We were arguing back and forth. And every time I would say to him, well, da, 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 da. And then I'd say over. And then I'd go, shit. Okay, then, you know, and then go back on there and putting on my poker face. And then there were all these oil rig operators that were interrupting and just shouting obscene things at me, you know, trying to intimidate me. And I was just in this complete panic, but holding it together. The radio operator was probably laughing his head off, our radio operator. But finally, there came a point where the skipper of our boat, Peter Wilcox, you should Google him up. He is like,
yes, I remember the name.
He is like epic in Greenpeace.
Yeah.
So he was the skipper. And at one point, he says to me, tell him he can veer off. And he gave me coordinates because he's saying he can't stop. He can't veer off. And he goes, you know, he was saying he was like between a rock and a hard place. And Peter says, tell him he can go here. And so I told him that, and then finally the guy said okay, and he did it. So we won the little campaign, and I was all happy, and we made him go away, and we made a big stink, and the lease sale didn't go ahead, as I recall, at least not. I don't know if it has since. There's all sorts of attempts to revive offshore oil drilling, but yeah, that wasn't even getting in front of a harpoon or something with somebody shooting at me. So yeah, I discovered though after that I'm really better at the office side of things than being out on a ship, really.
Well, what is, you mean the office side of things, as in coordinating the many steps, the many pieces of what it takes to do a campaign? And is that essentially the work that you do now, is help people understand what it takes to do that?
Sometimes. I mean, since leaving Greenpeace, I did 2 5-year stints as coalition coordinators. So that was not only just sort of training and helping, that was active coordination. But yeah, I do sort of workshops and trainings. I mean, I think the really big thing people need to understand, which they often don't, it surprises me, what just kind of came naturally in Greenpeace was not obvious in other places always. I mean, some places was, but not always. And that is, you have to start by mapping the power in the situation. Who actually has the power to make the decision you want to have taken? It may be this person nominally has the power, but they don't necessarily have the ability to do that. It's like saying, Obama could put the healthcare system into, you may think he's in charge of the country, but he wasn't entirely,
Right.
So you have to really think who's holding the power. And then you have to think what's driving them, what influences them, who influences them, who's their base, who's their, and how do you get at those people? And how do you get different messengers? If Greenpeace is saying something, it may not appeal in the same way that some, Silicon Valley tech person saying it, just as an example. You have to really think and mapping those power dynamics, and then trying to think about where you can best intervene in a complex system where all of these things are happening. Where are the Achilles heels in the system? Where, if you intervene here, can you have a snowball effect and have other things? Because you can never fight these companies or governments. We don't have the resources as non-governmental organizations. So you have to think where you can get more bang for your buck.
No, exactly. As you were talking, I had this image of, so I'm not a skier, but periodically, I've gone to ski places, the illusion of the bunny slope is, and every morning you'd hear these blasts, and you suddenly realize, like at some point, oh, these are setting off detonations to avoid avalanche, right? But by placing the blasts in, you're not going to bring down this whole mountain by yourself. It takes too much stuff. But if you put it in the right place, you might be able to bring down what you need to bring down to do that. So
that's a very good analogy. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would imagine that's exactly the kind of thinking that comes with back to that conversation about, over the years, you get wiser about, well, wait a second, let's, I'm too tired to do this until 2 o'clock in the morning. Can't we finish something by 9 o'clock by putting it here and here and here?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, and that brings another facet of what I do. I'm really good at doing campaign evaluations when things screw up. Why did they screw up? Because I've seen all the possible ways things screw up. Yeah. And I'm very good at kind of diagnostics in that regard and seeing what's not working and why. And it's interesting. I'll tell you, probably the number one thing I could point to about why things screw up is that not everybody understood the goal. Not everybody was working to the exact same goal. Because as you know, sometimes everybody fudges it to try to get to an agreement on something, and you get this language that's a little bit soft, so everybody can come away feeling they had something, and everybody's working to that same quote unquote goal, but it's slightly different. And then suddenly things go seriously wrong in the middle of the heat of the action, because I thought we were doing this. Well, I thought we were doing that. And they're at cross purposes. So yeah, I've seen a lot over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. You've also seen, I mean, I remember you were on the ship that was, you had just been on the ship that was it the French ultimately?
Yeah, the French blew up the Rainbow Warrior. Yeah.
Rainbow Warrior, yeah. And
that same boat, my smokestack that I had needle gunned,
yeah,
got blown up in Auckland Harbor. Yeah. I was down there. There was this Pacific Peace Voyage that had been done over the last several months in the Pacific, which started out with evacuating the Rongelap Islanders, the part of the Marshall Islands.
Yes,
so they were evacuated because of the really high level of radioactivity, and other things were done along the way. The boat came into Auckland, where it was getting ready, some change of crew and whatever, where it was about to go out on a flotilla out to Mororoa to protest French nuclear testing at the Mororoa Atoll. And well, as it turns out, the French put a spy in the Greenpeace office, like a proper serious spy, for some bit of time, who she'd gone by then. And they apparently found this campaign to be a huge threat. And so I was there. I was on holiday, actually, on vacation. My boyfriend was the coordinator of that expedition, Steve Sawyer. And he, it was his 29th birthday. And we'd been in town, and there had been, just kind of a dinner party, and we were back on the boat. And it was kind of a party, and the crew gave him some presents, and there was cake and stuff like that, and drinking. And then down in the Rainbow Warrior was an old North Sea trawler, and it had a fish hold, and that had been converted into a theater for when people came on board, sort of an education place. And all the crew were down, not the crew, but the skippers for this flotilla were having a meeting down there. So Steve was down there, and we needed to go somewhere else. There was a meeting of some of the trustees from the international organization meeting outside of the city starting the next day. And so I kind of prompted them to hurry up and finish, because we needed to get going, because somebody was driving us out there. And so we left, and then 15 minutes later, apparently, is when the first bomb went off. And if they'd still been down there, they would have all been killed, because the water would have been rushing down. They wouldn't have been able to get back out.
My recollection is that some people were killed, right?
One person, yeah.
One person.
So the first bomb went off, and that was like where the engine room was on the side. And everybody was quickly.
These are bombs planted not by somebody who was the spy, but by people underwater.
Frogmen. Yes. Right. Yes.
Like it was a real military operation.
Yeah, there were three different teams that carried out this operation, as it turned out. And so the first bomb went off, and Peter Wilcox, the same skipper, he was asleep in his bunk, stark naked and without his glasses, when running up, abandoned ship. He ended up on the side, on the wharf, stark naked and blind at that point. But everybody was kind of abandoning ship. And a couple of people went back down into the crew quarters. One went down because the cook had been down there sleeping, and he wanted to get her out of there. Another one went down there because he thought his girlfriend might be down there. She wasn't. But as he was coming up, Fernando Pereira, who was the photographer, was coming down. And nobody knows what he was doing, but I can tell you, as somebody who has photography as a hobby, when something is like that is happening and you are the ship's photographer, you're going to get your camera to document it, to get pictures. And as he went down, the second bomb went off, which was right on the outside of the hull where the crew quarters were. So he was killed, but nobody knew yet. So we got a call. We were out about a 45-minute drive away, and we got a call. The person who had driven us out there said that she'd gotten a call from a journalist saying that there had been explosions aboard the Rainbow Warrior, and it was sunk at the bottom of the harbor. Did we have any comments on it? Of course, we knew nothing about anything, and this was pre-cell phone days, pre-ability to get that kind of information. So several of us jumped in the car and went back to Auckland, 45 minutes driving, not knowing if everyone was dead or, what had happened. And yeah, it was a long night. We sat in the police station, which was kind of across the way from the wharf. And sometime towards morning, Fernando's body was found. And then over the course of the next few weeks, it was like being inside of a spy novel as one revelation after the next came out.
Was there some sort of a connection? Did the authorities in Australia, or New Zealand rather, know that the French were up to this? Was there some sort of no? It was the
UK
French
government.
operation.
There is strong evidence the UK government knew about it, and probably the US government knew about it. And Australia certainly screwed up the investigation, which makes you wonder what their part was. But no, New Zealand was outraged. You remember at that time, New Zealand had announced that they were nuclear free, and as part of the ANZUS alliance, you had to accept nuclear weapons on your soil. So New Zealand was at odds with various other of its allies, military allies. But yeah, it turned out that there were three teams that did it. First was a boat, a private yacht with a crew that brought in the explosives. And then there was a team that a couple posing as a Swiss couple honeymooning. They were DGSE agents, military, colonels or whatever. And they pretended to be on their honeymoon, driving the van down to Auckland with the explosives in it. And then there was a third team that were the frogmen who placed the bombs on the side. And it was only just coincidental that this all unraveled, because there had been some burglaries in the harbor, and there was a bit of a equivalent of a neighborhood watch, keeping eye. And somebody saw this rental car van in the middle, I guess it was in the evening, late in the evening, nighttime, and thought it was a little suspicious and wrote the license plate number down. So the next day, when the news of the bombing hit, these people thought, this is interesting. And they called in the police, and they gave this rental car number. So the police tracked down the rental car to this quote unquote Swiss honeymoon couple and put a hold on it. And it's kind of funny if you think about it. They went back to return the car, and they wanted to get their deposit back. And the people at the rental car saw this notification and said, oh, hang on, we have to process it, and held them there. So they sat there quietly waiting to get their deposit refunded when the police came and took them away. And then it transpired that they weren't, in fact, Swiss tourists. And the Swiss were pretty pissed off with the French for using fake passports. And then, air tanks, oxygen tanks washed ashore that said made in France on them and things like that. It just became a bit ridiculous. But so when they figured out this sailboat that had brought in the explosives, it had left and was headed to Australia. And the New Zealand police asked the Australians to hold it and take samples in the hold for the explosives, for traces of the explosives, which they did. But then they let the boat go while they were being analyzed. And of course, they came back positive for the explosives, but the boat was gone. And then the French sent out a submarine that picked them up, and they pulled the plug and scuttled the boat out in the middle of the ocean and took them all home, and they were all awarded as heroes.
And what was the final? How did it all? Was it ever resolved? I mean, did the French ever fully admit it? Was there any sort of reparations to Greenpeace? Was there some sort of to Fernando's family?
Yeah. Eventually, it all came out. The evidence was clear. There was an international arbitration between the French government and Greenpeace, and also between the French government and Fernando's family, both of which ended up with a sizable settlement. Fernando's family, it's not public what that was, but Greenpeace got, I think, something like $7 million from the French government for that, which was used for buying a new ship, amongst other things.
A new boat, right? A new Rainbow Warrior. And does the now new Rainbow Warrior, now old
There's a
new
third
Rainbow,
one.
is there? Yeah, exactly. So it's still, there is still one.
Yes, there is a third one now, Rainbow Warrior 3, which is fully sail operated.
Ah,
It was built custom made. But one little footnote I have to tell you,
yeah.
I can't tell you within maybe 2-3 years how many people, when I wasn't a canvasser anymore by then, but people who were canvassing, oh, Greenpeace, aren't you that organization that blew up that French ship?
Oh, wow.
That became what people remembered. Yeah, that became a very common misunderstanding.
That's a little.
Adding insult to
Oh
injury,
my
literally.
gosh. Oh my God. Yeah, that's sad. I mean, it's so hard at this point now, knowing at least what most people know, that climate change is real, that forget climate change, that all sorts of other things that are poisoning people and are ruining the land and the air and the water and et cetera, real. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine people not thinking of themselves as somehow caring about the environment. And is it still the case that there's that there's a sense that anybody who is an environmentalist is in the way of progress, is in the way of where the world needs to go? Is it still as ferocious as it was? And I don't mean the bombing, but I mean maybe, but there was contention. I mean, just like you on the radio, and and people getting in the way of whaling ships. There was a confrontation. And now people who want the glaciers to melt, are insane, right? And most of the world that knows anything about it knows they're insane. So is there still that, why is it hard for environmentalists and environmental organizations to make the kind of progress they want to make? Is it simply people's lifestyles?
There's a lot to unpick in what you've said. The first thing I want to say is, my talking about how terrified I was as this recent college graduate staring down somebody who was shouting at me on a radio is child's play, quite literally, compared to what's happening in many parts of the world right now, where activists are just being murdered. Right. When you look at the corruption in countries like Brazil, for example, and in many other countries where activists just get murdered. And do they want the glaciers to melt? Do they want the rainforest to get there? It's corruption. It's self-enrichment. It is enrichment of companies. It is, I don't even think it's down to, oh, well, we need development because we're concerned about the poor. I mean, that is true in some countries as well. You look at China, who gets a lot of blame for greenhouse gas, for somehow sabotaging climate negotiations, when in fact, China is one of the lower per capita emitters, and they're doing way more than many countries in terms of trying to do this transition. But at the same time, they've got a lot of people still in poverty. Mm-hmm. So you have differing realities in different countries. Do anybody want the glaciers to melt? I don't know. Maybe if James Watt were still around, he probably wanted the glaciers to melt. I don't know. But I think for most people, in that situation that are perpetuating this, they either don't care or they think that it's all overblown. Some of them think that there will be a technological solution right. that will save the day. And, it's a complex question. But I think that really it's just, there's a long-standing communication strategy behind, certainly in the US, what the narrative that the oil companies have put out for many, many years. I mean, there's clear evidence. There's, Freedom of Information Act documents. There's exposés to, Exxon knew exactly what was happening for many years. There's a very cynical strategy to, to mislead the public, or there was in the past to mislead, still is, to mislead the public in the same way that the tobacco companies did. And, I think, and then people get misled by that out in the public. I think for a lot of people who deny the reality of climate change, it's not so much if they start with they don't like the solution and then work their way back from there. We don't like what this solution means, and therefore the problem can't be real, as opposed to let's look at the science, here's the problem, and now how do we go about solving it? And I think that's really, it's become such a tribal issue.
But is it that way elsewhere?
I think so. I think the US is the worst. I mean, you look at the UK and there's certainly, tribalism there as well. But at the same time, the UK doesn't deny, the government doesn't deny the problem of climate change. They just hosted the last climate conference and in Glasgow in December, and they, tried to accomplish a lot of good things. That's not to say that the UK government is doing everything right. They're not.
Right. Sure.
But there is tribalism. You definitely have the right-wing constituencies there who are in denial and dismissive. You have it in Australia, for example. You have it in quite a number of countries as well.
Yeah. Well, that's sad. So it's
I've spent a lot of the time that I've worked on this issue constantly trying to think about how we make it not tribal. Is there a way to do it? I remember right after the big Copenhagen climate conference, I don't know how much that registered outside of climate circles, but there was a huge amount of hope that governments were going to get together and come up with a binding international agreement, and the whole thing fell apart.
Right.
And great despondence after that. And so in early 2010, we were just trying to think, okay, how do we regroup? What's the strategy going forward? And I remember reading this article, it might have been in the New Yorker or something, talking about this thing called the Tea Party. It's like, whoa, what's that? And I actually, in that very beginning, thought, maybe this is what we need. These people, because at the beginning, the way it was described anyway, was that these people didn't like vested politics. They were into, being much more pragmatic about getting things done and doing things. And I thought, how can we get them on our side? Of course, that became very clearly that it was not.
How'd that work out?
Didn't work out so well. No, it became very clearly that it was created by the right. It wasn't something that just emerged as a genuine movement, as far as I understand it. But there was, for example, some years ago, I don't know what's happening with that now, but there was some Tea Party type groups in the southeastern US that were totally in favor of wind power, because, the Tea Party was really about, was about tax and economic stuff. And wind power makes a whole lot of financial sense. And so they were like promoting this. And I was thinking, yeah, you need to have messengers who are not only people like me. There's this thing, I forget what it's called. I'd have to look it up. I want to say cultural dynamics or whatever, where they've mapped all of these value senses, and there's different people. And if you look at these different, I think there's 12 different value segmentations. And if you go to their website, you can do the test. And I used to, when I was running this coalition on climate, which was meant to be trying to bring in different constituencies and different voices and all of that, and everybody would just have these truths. And I would have them do that test. And literally every single one of us was in slice 1 of 12, all of us. There wasn't a single person who was in any of these other, value categories. And you think, this is why when we start trying to communicate based on what we think and feel and think is right and makes sense to us, it doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of other people.
And in fact, and frequently, depending upon what the conversation is just the opposite of resonating, right? I mean, it's they don't trust. That person doesn't, and you wish it were different, but there's a way in which, like, why should they trust you? Don't trust them, and they can feel it, right? I don't mean you, but right. So Yeah, there's,
Well, there was a study, I've never read it. Somebody told me about it, but I've seen things which confirm to me that it's true. That they did this study, like with the hotel towels, if you drop them on the floor, that means you want them washed. If you hang them back up, it means you'll reuse your towels. And when they put up notes in the rooms saying this is good for the environment, whatever, more people drop the towels on the floor than when you put up a note saying everyone else is doing this. Most people hang up the towels again. There was this massive discrepancy in the numbers because most people they want to do it because their neighbors are doing it or because everyone else is doing it, not because it's an environmental thing. The environmental thing can be a big turnoff.
I thought you were going to say, you were going to say what my experience is when I stay in a hotel. And of course, it's the same thing. It's like, you drop the towels on the ground if you want them replaced. And I never drop the towels on the ground. I'm not going to be there forever. Why would I want them replaced? Come on, it's just water. And they replace them. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, that too as well.
It's like, wait a second.
As well. I know.
think the only thing that stopped them from doing that was COVID. They don't come into the room.
I guess the solution is to just not take showers and leave them all hanging there perfectly.
Exactly. Either that or to continually have a pandemic, one or the other. So, is there something else that you think is important to talk about that people should be thinking about? That
there are lots of things. One thing that's really big in the climate negotiations has to do with loss and damage. I mean, you've got a law background. You should understand this. What about countries that are poorer and have natural resources and are being told not to use them now because it's bad for the climate? We're all in this big boat together. And not only are they being told not to use them, but they're also suffering from heat waves and storms, and they don't have the resilience or capacity to protect their population. Who pays for that?
Right. Well, yes, exactly.
And where does that money come from?
That's the question. That's a kind of a question that when you ask that in a room, like a lot of people from the countries that have been doing the stuff that's damaging the world, they start taking incredible interest in their shoes. Like, who pays for that? Well, geez, look at that. And like, not me. What do you mean? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, it's amazing to me that in the instances where countries, where under-resourced countries, financially that is, are actually considering, okay, we want to do our part. We don't want to use those resources. So who's going to help? I mean, just the idea that they're open to that question, right, is amazing in and of itself, is a commitment in and of itself, because wait, now you're telling me I can't do that? You've been doing that for 200 years. What do you mean I can't do that? I didn't do this. You did this.
Well, most of the rich governments don't want it on the agenda. It's been a big fight to even have the conversation.
Right.
And so that's becoming a pretty big thing. And of course, the whole question at this point becomes adaptation. How do we adapt to the changing climate, and can we adapt? And what's that going to entail is another big question. I always felt, there was always a difference of opinion about, if you talk about adaptation, does that somehow suggest you've given up on mitigation? And we need to hold governments accountable and keep pushing for reduction in greenhouse gases. I always felt that if you looked at adaptation and what that really means, that would be one of your biggest selling points for mitigation, because when you realize how hard it is and how expensive it is,
yes,
that mitigation looks like a much better option.
Yeah.
But that's really, I live in the Netherlands. We're way below sea level, and it feels like, on the one hand, a scary place to be. On the other hand, the Dutch have been managing water for centuries, and in fact, they send people out into the world to advise governments on how to do this. But there comes a point where, if the entire Antarctic ice cap melts, the kind of sea level rise we'd be talking about is probably even beyond the capabilities of the Dutch to manage. So yeah, it's really, that adaptation question is going to get bigger and bigger, I think.
Yeah, well, it's always occurred. I mean, it's always felt to me like it's important to have the adaptation conversation going on just quietly over here, because otherwise it does sort of imply that all we have to do is adapt. Oh, good, thank God. I don't have to change any of my behavior. I just have to learn to adapt to some of those problems. It's such it has such a benign feel to it because we're human beings. We're the most adaptable creature on the planet. Except
so
in the right
technologically
direction.
smart.
Yes, indeed. We can think our way out of anything.
I loved that movie Waterworld. Do you remember that one with Kevin Costner? Everybody panned it and thought it was a horrible movie. I just thought it was great. It's like a little bit.
This is your life.
And by the way, speaking of This Is Your Life, I don't know if you've seen that book, The Ministry for the Future. Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction writer. It's all about climate change. And I bought this book and I read the first chapter is one of the most horrific things you will ever read about climate change. It's about a heat wave in India. I mean, it's a novel. So it's you live through this deadly heat wave where literally everyone is dying and the Westerner is, trying to, use his air conditioning or whatever. I got through the first chapter and I'm thinking, oh my Lord. And then as it went on from there, it felt too much like my day job. As I mentioned, I'm good at compartmentalizing. That's like, I don't need to read this at night. And it was too much about the climate negotiations and all that. It's like, yeah, no. So I gave myself permission to put it down and not read the rest of it. But for somebody who that's not your day job, you might want to take a look at that book.
Well, so say something as we come to a close. Say something that you're hopeful about.
Well, what's happening with the whole renewable energy scene is just so revolutionary. It's incredible, the speed at which we are developing technologies. It's astounding. And every time there's a scenario which predicts how much, for example, wind or solar we're going to have, it beats it by a long shot. So, and as I said earlier, when you look and see when governments finally decide to treat something as a crisis, it is amazing how quickly things can turn. And also, as I said earlier about that healing crisis I went through, change doesn't necessarily happen incrementally. And I think we are in a point of big crisis right now on a lot of levels. But I firmly believe that it is possible that there could be a very fast and abrupt change for the better in terms of action being taken.
I think that's super important to continue to point out. I mentioned my conversation with Bill Ayers, and in it was that reminder that, it happens that way on so many different fronts. And, the day before the students, young people from SNCC sat down in the lunchroom, in the luncheonette at the counter in the South, where they were not allowed to sit to be served, nobody would have expected it, right? I mean, the day before, everybody was just polite and in their place. The day before, Rosa Parks sat down in the bus. Who would have thought? Like, who would have thought? And yet, just like that, not without struggle and not without effort and not without fight, but who would have thought? So I think that's super wise and true.
Yeah, I mean, look at South Africa. Look how quickly once apartheid fell. Look how that. I mean, it was a long struggle and fight, and Nelson Mandela sat in jail for 25 years, but suddenly a decision was made to change it, and it happened.
Yeah. So, yeah, and yes, there are all sorts of problems that remain. But I mean, I think what you said way back at the beginning of our conversation is, good things happening do not always make it into the news. But and flying into Los Angeles is an incredibly different experience right now. Are there problems? Absolutely. There are so many problems. Yes. And but there's ways in which, at least on some fronts in the world, things have never been this good. But so which is not to say stop. So, and I hope you don't stop, because
well, I'm getting well, I have no intention of stopping anytime soon, but it is I am 65 at this point, and I do believe.
How did you suddenly get older than me?
I'm not older than you, never will be. You'll always have a few years on me. No, but I sort of feel like I think sometimes some of the young people would probably consider what I do to be a bit old school. And I think, that's fine. It's time for, I feel like my role is more to empower other people than to try to do it myself, because it's, this generation has inherited this and they have to fight their way out of it.
But just that, just that insight that, maybe they had it, but maybe not. Just that, look, it's important to make some noise, but making noise in the right places is even better. Putting that charge where it needs to be.
Yeah.
So, well, Kelly Rigg, thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation and be curious together and reminiscing and.
No, it was fun. It was fun to talk to you. It's been a long time, and
yeah,
as I said, you were there at the very beginning, so now you see how it turned out.
A button. So now.